Hello Bio, this is Mr. B. We're going to finish up section 2 today. If you remember, we ended talking about what is called the protenoid microsphere, and remember that's just a small sphere or small ball of protein, and how they had characteristics of cells, but they were not cells. So now we're going to take a look at how maybe some of our other things that are actually present in us today and all living things came about. And the first thing is RNA and DNA. So we're going to look at how possibly DNA and RNA could have evolved. And the big thing to know is that there's several hypotheses to suggest what actually happened. So again, we don't exactly know because no one was there to watch, oh hey look, RNA just evolved. So again, big thing is a lot of speculation here. So one hypothesis says that some RNA sequences can help DNA replicate under the right conditions, so maybe that would mean that RNA came first. And some RNA molecules can even grow and duplicate themselves, suggesting RNA might have existed before DNA. So there are some theories that RNA might have came first. However, we do not know. So they have this picture right here, which I won't ever have you memorize anything with this picture. The one thing I would want you to take away from this picture is that we do not know which came first, DNA or RNA. It's a really complex kind of subject. We could probably spend an entire semester talking about which one came first based on the evidence. So what I want you to know about evolution of RNA and DNA is that it's really up for grabs and that we really do not know which one came first. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is kind of going away from actually life itself, but one of the most important things that's necessary for life today, and that is free oxygen. And so what free oxygen means is that the only oxygen we had on this time was in the form of water, and so water is H2O, so there's no oxygen by itself. So it's not talking about oxygen you don't have to pay for. Free oxygen refers to oxygen that isn't bound to water, that is actually just by itself. And so how we know about free oxygen. So microscopic fossils, or simply microfossils, of unicellular prokaryotic organisms resembling modern bacteria have been found in rocks over 3.5 billion years old. So our first life forms existed about 3.5 billion years ago. And these first life forms, they evolved without oxygen. And some of them still live today. There are some life forms we talked about, remember the archaea bacteria, that do not need oxygen to survive. And so that's what our first life form was like. They did not need oxygen. However, about 2.2 billion years ago, there's some photosynthetic bacteria began to pump oxygen into our oceans. So again, that's where they were living, and then they were taking and they were releasing free oxygen. They were releasing oxygen that wasn't attached to the water. And so then, because of this, it filled up in the oceans, and then it accumulated in the atmosphere as well. So that's how oxygen came into the atmosphere, was about 2.2 billion years ago. Photosynthetic bacteria gave rise to it. And so this is not going to occur without some consequences. So there were some things that happened when oxygen was added to the Earth's atmosphere. It sounds good for us. However, for the life forms at that time, it was not such a good deal, because the rise of oxygen in the atmosphere drove some life forms to extinction because they did not need oxygen. And in fact, oxygen is toxic to them, and that's kind of still going on today. There are organisms that if they are exposed to oxygen, again some bacteria, they will in fact die. However, while some went extinct, other life forms evolved new, more efficient metabolic pathways that use oxygen for respiration. So remember, cellular respiration is just the cell's way of making energy. So while some went extinct, others evolved more effective ways to actually use oxygen to help them create energy for themselves. So oxygen was helpful for some, killed off a lot. So that's an important thing to know. Oxygen was not great for all life on Earth at that time. However, it's great for us today because it's what we rely on. And so now we had prokaryotic cells, which again are those simple bacteria. They came along probably from those protenoid microspheres. And so now we're going to look at how our eukaryotic cells came to be. So how are more complex cells like that we are made up, that have actual individual organelles and a nucleus and everything like that. So how did they come to be? And so the most overriding theory at this time is what's called the endosymbiotic theory. And again, this word kind of sounds confusing, but we know endo means inside, and then symbiotic is symbiosis, which is two organisms living closely together. And so endosymbiotic means two organisms living closely together actually inside of one thing. So the endosymbiotic theory proposes that eukaryotic cells arose from living communities that were formed by prokaryotic organisms. So it's prokaryotic organisms that were living very closely to one another is what formed our eukaryotic cells. And so here's kind of a picture breaking down what it means. We're going to take a look at kind of each one of these more in depth though, and we're going to take a look at this picture in class. So our first step is that about 2 billion years ago, prokaryotic cells began evolving internal cell membranes. So prokaryotic cells had cell membranes inside of them. And then because of this, they became the ancestor of all eukaryotic cells, because all eukaryotic cells now have a cell membrane as well. And so according to this theory, eukaryotic cells formed from a symbiosis among several different prokaryotes. So what happened was, several prokaryotes would start living together, basically inside this one cell membrane. Then over time, that gave rise to a more complex cell, or to our eukaryotic cells. And so what would happen here are first our aerobic, which means it uses oxygen, bacteria. They all they're moving inside of this nuclear envelope. So multiple bacteria are moving inside one cell membrane with a nuclear envelope on the inside. So the first step is they're moving in, starting to become closer together. And so our prokaryotes that used oxygen to generate energy-rich molecules of ATP, they evolved into our mitochondria. And so we know mitochondria actually have their own DNA, their own kind of genetic information, so that evidence supports that. To whereas prokaryotes that carried out photosynthesis, they evolved into chloroplasts. So photosynthetic bacteria came together and they became the organelle that we call chloroplasts. And so that is basically kind of the endosymbiotic theory. It's just multiple unicellular prokaryotes came together to form our primitive eukaryotes. So to finish things up, we're going to look at how our organisms reproduce. So most prokaryotes reproduce asexually at that time, and asexual reproduction, which again we've talked about this before, it yields daughter cells that are exact copies of the parent cell. And so again, it's just like making an exact copy of yourself, and restricts genetic variation to mutations in DNA, so there's not a lot of genetic variation. However, with sexual reproduction, which is done by our eukaryotic cells, most eukaryotic cells, there's some that do asexual, so offspring will never resemble their parents exactly. So that's why you don't look exactly like your mom or exactly like your dad. There's an increased probability that favorable combinations will be produced. So that's again with actually good mutations happening and good genes coming together to make even better traits in the offspring. And there's an increased chance of evolutionary change due to natural selection. So again, with all these different genes coming together, there's going to be more change happening. So that is it for section 2. And again, these are our early life, the type of reproduction that was occurring, and kind of how they led to our life today. So let me know if you have any questions.